Let's get going. Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. Again, we're so happy to have you here today. And of course, as we're engaging in conversations about online learning, we have technical difficulties with Zoom. So that's the way it rolls. But before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So as a step towards honoring and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that folks are gathering from across the country and some from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the native people where you are joining us from, and you can do that in the chat. Feel free to share. I'm participating from Chicago, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. And today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides here in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We also want to acknowledge and recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. We commit to move beyond words and into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. And thank you all for sharing. So we're really happy and excited to have the webinar today, Engaging Online, Promising Practices in E-Service Learning and Digital Civic Engagement. As you know, we've all been kind of thrown into this new world of e-service learning with the pandemic, and so happy to have our wonderful presenters share with us, and I'll be introducing them shortly. I just want to make a couple of announcements. I encourage you to check out our Compact Nation podcast on any of your favorite podcast listening apps. We're about to finish the season, and I think we had a really great season with a lot of really powerful panelists and speakers, and so I just encourage you to check that out, and you can find it at Compact Nation. And if you have any suggestions for next year's podcast, feel free to email me at morales@compact.org or campuscompact@compact.org as well for any ideas. Also, our impact awards are open, nominations are open. You can look for that information on compact.org. We have nominations for faculty awards, community engagement professional awards, and awards for foreign two-year institutions. And those awards are open. The nomination period is closes September 15th. Again, for more information, you can go to compact.org. And I'm going to go ahead now and introduce our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Jean Straight, who's with the FACE Foundation and co-editor of the E-Service Learning and the International Journal of Research on Service Learning and Teacher Education. Catherine Neudig with Missouri State University and co-editor of E-Service Learning. John Hammerlink, Director of Grants Development at the University of Minnesota Morris. Lance Eaton, Educational Programs Manager at the Berkman Klein Center of Internet and Society at Harvard University. Danielle Leek, Director of Academic Innovation and Distance Education at Bunker Hill Community College. And our very own Jane Turk, Director of Member Engagement at Iowa Minnesota Campus Compact and contributor to the e-service learning book. So welcome to our panelists. I will turn it over to you. I don't have the poll since we had to switch. So maybe we'll add them.
I think we'll roll with it. I think
we'll roll with it. That's right. That is our motto.
Exactly. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jane Turk. I will be kicking us off today then we'll move into our main webinar content. So glad you're here today. And again, it's not, let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. Hold on. It's not surprising that, So we're running into nothing. Katie, could you allow me to share the screen and or share my slide presentation, please?
Yes, on it. Just one second.
Thank you so much. But again, I think this is actually a really great lesson in practice. Online environments can sometimes be a bit unpredictable, and you can have limited control over tools and the circumstances that are allowing people to participate online. So flexibility is really important when thinking about engaging in online partnerships. I'd say partnership construction more broadly in teaching and learning too, but particularly in online environments. So
You should be set. You want to give it another try, Jane?
I see it now. Thank you, Katie. So I am going to go ahead now and just present a few slides to give some sense of what we'll be doing together today and a little bit about what brought us together and to this moment in the first place. A couple things I wanted to point out as well, or one thing on this particular slide. You'll see in the bottom part of the slide, resources are available. There's a Google Doc of resources, and we'll add to that after the presentation as well to make sure we capture some of the resources that we gather together in our time today. They're available at tinyurl.com/cc engaging online. So this link will appear again in another part of the presentation as well. And we can also share that in the chat so folks can go ahead and link through to those resources. So as a bit of introduction, what brought us together today and what can you expect from your participation today? So as Marisol alluded to, many of us are contributors to the e-service learning volume published by Stylus in 2016. A lot has happened since the publication of the book. So at first, what brought us to the table today, of course, is several of us are contributors to the volume, and others who have joined us today are fans of, they've said this, of the book itself too. So that was one reason that we all gathered together to host this conversation. Among us too were teachers and faculty, educational developers, instructional designers, administrators, fundraising and grant development supporters, and also Campus Compact staff. So that's a sampling of some of the roles that brought us into the conversation today. And as you have your breakout room conversations too, taking a moment at the beginning to get a sense of who's in the room too. And if you want to actually add that in the chat, that actually might be a good way to pivot from using a poll. What primary role brought you to the conversation today so folks can kind of see where we're coming from in terms of the lands that we're situated on, and also what brought us here in terms of our roles. We've also, in terms of where we're coming from and what brought us together, we've worked in a variety of different contexts. So in, with, and in partnership with the following, among other things too. So a range of community partners we have partnered with, worked with a range of departments, centers, and programs on individual campuses, both at urban and small town-based institutions, large public and private research universities, liberal arts colleges and universities, community colleges, and also work through higher ed consortia and associations, including Campus Compact. So just to get a sense of, and when we're hearing from the panelists today, some context of the various different areas that bring us to this work. So in terms of if that's where we're coming from, what should you expect as participants today? So here's the format, and it's a little bit different than the formats of previous Campus Compact webinar series webinars, just in terms of the sequencing of how we're doing our conversation today. We recognize that another thing that's brought us here today is the circumstances of this moment. So a lot of what is known before now gives us some foundation, but a lot of the new information that we're getting and new strategies we're developing come through this interaction, connection, and conversation. So we're going to keep it very conversational today, knowing that we've shared with you the resource list that we will continue to supplement as we move through this session together. So we're going to have a framing panel conversation about some big themes, strategies, key takeaways that we think it would be important to treat among the panelists. Then we are going to move into breakout room discussions among you, the participants, where we're going to ask you to think about these questions, which I think too it's good to hold in your own awareness right now as we're moving through the panel portion of the webinar as well. So what is your most pressing need or concern right now when it comes to online civic engagement and community engaged learning and teaching? How do you or would you like to connect and engage with others to develop and deepen your practice of online civic engagement and community engaged learning and teaching? Recognizing this is going to be an ongoing process through at least the next semester as we move back onto our campuses or in our respective community organizations. And what is your next step in developing online civic engagement and community engaged learning and teaching? So we thought this would be sort of generative sort of frames for the conversation, and particularly for you to treat in the breakout rooms or consider in the breakout rooms. I'll talk in a moment about how we'll be kind of harvesting that work as well. Also, we'll give you another channel other than the chat to share some questions you might have for the panel. And to that end, we'll come back together then after that middle portion of breakout room conversation to have a larger Q&A that's more open with the panelists to kind of answer any questions that will come up when you're having those small group conversations. So in terms of your participation today, we ask that, apologies. We ask that you contribute and ask questions in the Zoom chat and in your breakout room discussions with care, respect, self-awareness, and attention to the impact. So take that as you will and try to engage respectively and productively and collaboratively with the folks today on the call. Use the provided Google form to capture notes, takeaways, and resources that you share during the breakout room discussions. This is the second tiny URL that's going to take you directly to a Google form. So if you have a question, you have a resource to share, please do so using this form. This will be shared again before we move into breakout room discussions. And then again, your session resources will be available at that first link that I shared. So with that, I am going to go ahead and stop my screen sharing and let's move into our conversation. If you do have any questions about format or running into concerns, you can also share that in the chat, and the Campus Compact, Marisol and Katie, who's also on this call, will share that with me as well while I'm moderating. So please feel free to use the chat in that way too if it's helpful. So I will stop talking and get to our actual panelists. And so first, I want to invite a question or a response or pose a question to Jean Straight and Kathy Nordyke, who were the editors of the eService Learning volume. So Jean and Kathy, are you here? Are you with us?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Kathy, I'll let you go first.
So I will ask the question, and then Kathy will go first, and then Jean, you can jump off from there. So in this current moment, and with that context in mind, what do you think are the most important considerations when reimagining face-to-face civic engagement and community engagement in an online environment?
Wow, big question to start things off. And first of all, let me thank all of you for the opportunity to present today, and for Campus Compact for hosting this, and the opportunity to work with all of my colleagues and Jean Straight, my co-editor. You know, I think in a time like this that we have to reimagine service learning as a whole. When COVID hit back March, April, we had to rethink how all of our students that were out in the field doing direct service learning, whether they were in a seated class or in an online class, what that was going to look like for them, and how we would work with faculty, how we would work with community partner learning sites, and how we would work with our students to ensure that there was still academic rigor maintained within the service learning courses that they were enrolled in, but that our community partner learning sites and that our students were still truly benefiting from experiences that moved from the direct realm to the indirect, the advocacy-based types of service learning, or the community-based research types of service learning. And a lot of that was really helping our community partners to really think about what that would look like within their organization. And so I think really from this point moving forward, because we don't know what's going to happen in our communities with mask ordinances and social distancing, and whether schools will be back in sessions and what organizations are truly opening back up to the public. I think that we have to think outside the box, and we have to be innovative and creative in identifying what service learning is going to look like for our students, the faculty that utilize service learning as a teaching pedagogy, and then our community partners as well. So that would be my initial. Jean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
That sounds good. I love how we work together. You always get the above picture, and then I come down to nuts and bolts, which is perfect. Thank you also for having us. I think one of the things I started thinking about, I just started making a list, and I thought if I was going to be teaching online right now, what are some of the things I'd want to think about? And I know one of the things that we have in the book is a pre-planning guide. It's on page 18, and it talks about how you can start thinking about how to plan this stuff with your community partners. But I also believe that you have to think about how the service and the class is structured. We talk about the different kinds of service learning, being from, having your class fully online to partially online hybrid to, face-to-face, and there's all the different hybrids that we talk about in the book. But I think thinking about how it's structured, and there's a really nice little graph on page 26. If any of you have the book, you can take a little peek at that. But I know beyond everything else, one of the other things I think about is how do we identify community partners and projects that are suitable for online implementation? I think that's a big question right there. Included within that, you have to think about how are you going to communicate with community partners and how you'll have your community partners engaging with your students online if you're doing a lot of classes online. So the technology, what kinds of technology you will be using, whether or not they have it. I know that in the K-12 world, here in Minnesota, where I'm located, the governor just did a big survey of the spring online work that we did in K-12. And there are a lot of people that are reporting that they don't have the technology, over 37%. So that's a very big issue. So having the technology there is going to be important. Also, I think that you need to think about how it will be led. So you're thinking about your leadership. I think that you need to think about how you will be working with diverse communities and what that will look like. There's a wonderful social justice pedagogy piece that was put together by Guthrie and McCracken in 2010. And it has 4 different steps for how to put together a social justice pedagogy in an online class, which is a really great resource. If you want it, I can send it over to you too. And I will make sure we have it available for you after. Any kind of strategies for trauma and informed distance learning, I think would be very valuable. But here's the other thing I found just recently. A lot of students, whether it's face-to-face or online, have some genuine fears about interacting with community. Yes. And so I think having discussions about, honest and open discussions about what are you afraid of? Well, I think I could talk to each one of us. We're all afraid of things we don't know, right? So that could be another issue to think about. So planning, technology, communication, how the service is structured, how you identify community partners that can go online with you and what that might look like, and using social justice pedagogies. Those are just a couple pieces I was thinking about. Kathy, anything else?
No, I think that's really great, Jean, and all of those things are so important. And I think really, identifies that we have to focus on those things. We have to think outside the box, but we kind of have to go through the steps, and we have to identify those community partners, and we have to help them think about what that now looks like in working with our service learning students, because they're not going to be necessarily in their places. It's not necessarily going to be that face-to-face interaction. So helping to prepare them and making sure that they have the tools to not only make it meaningful for the student, but to ensure that the student is learning that reciprocity and meeting the needs of addressing that problem or issue that the community partner is working to address within their community.
Absolutely, I agree.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Jean. And Kathy, that's a wonderful segue to the next question, actually. And I'd like to invite John Hammerlink, another contributor to the eService Learning volume, to answer this next question. So John, are you here?
I am here.
Awesome. Hi, John. And so the question I have for you is, what are some useful models and strategies for developing online activities, assignments, and assessments that center community needs and community impact?
Thanks. For those of you who know me, I bring a little more radical view to this whole picture. So I'm just going to say right up front, maybe folks should think of alternatives to their traditional notions of service learning, their traditional definitions of community. One of the things that I would suggest is actually taking this upcoming semester and focusing on the campus community. Focus on what students are saying. You need to listen to students. There's a lot of issues around student mental health. The things that students are really concerned about right now: Black Lives Matter, policing. In the upcoming semester, the election will be foremost in everybody's mind. So I would say maybe take a break from thinking about having groups of students volunteer with community organizations and think about the health and wellness of your campus community. I think you can also, a lot of my work, I'm really active in a group called ABCD in Action, which is hosted by the ABCD Institute at DePaul. There's a number of ways that you can use mapping assets of individual classes, courses, or an entire campus to help address issues that students have identified. I think you can also use this time to better prepare students for future in-person experience, particularly through this COVID lens. I don't think we can assume that there will be place-based anything anytime soon. And when you do go back, it's going to be very different. So I think your community partners are dealing with new realities, and you might just want to not bother them right now with trying to help you figure out how to do something for your class, but maybe have a conversation with them that just says, look, we're here. When you're ready to talk, let us know. I think we can use this time to work with students to figure out how we can engage as higher ed with the community with more humility, with recognizing gifts and wisdom of the community before showing up as an expert. I think there's a lot of work that we can do internally to help us prepare both students and ourselves as folks who are helping students be better at what we want to do. I think if you're just absolutely set on having some kind of community-based project, Kathy mentioned earlier, community-based research. I think if you have somebody who has traditionally done kind of voluntary kind of service learning, consider community-based research or community-based participatory research, especially where community creates the research agenda, and then they take the data, they take the findings, and they can advocate for what they need. So think about that switch as opposed to sort of a volunteer-based. Another thing that you can think about is having students, I think students, even students, if you're starting on campus, a month in, we might all be at home again. Figure out a strategy for students to serve the community where they are, as opposed to a community that surrounds your institution. And trust that students can figure that out, that they can create relationships and do some meaningful service in the community where they exist.
Great.
The last thing I just wanted to talk about
Sure.
is because the question actually talked about assessments. And so I think that I'm a big fan of not doing things like service learning unless you are as committed to the outcomes as the community partner is. So you have to want the change that they want to create in the world as much as you want your students to learn something. Otherwise, don't do it. I mean, just don't engage with somebody unless you want to be committed to what they want to change in the world. And so one of the ways that we can think about assessing the service, you know, where's the service in service learning, is there's a couple different things. One is to look at community capitals framework. It was developed by Cornelia and Jan Florida at Iowa State in the early 2000s. There's a lot of stuff on that online. Otherwise, contact me, I can point you in some directions. And the last thing I would say about assessment is, I've always thought that, you know, we trust, so that you're assessing service and you're assessing learning, we trust students with assessing the learning, right? So we have them do reflection to demonstrate that there was learning. So we need to trust our community partners to assess the service. And that has to be as robust a set of criteria and reflections. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. The next question, we're going to turn a little bit more for the next question to thinking about learning technologies, constructing online learning environments. And so I'd like to invite Lance Eaton to answer this question. I see you're on my same page, literally, Lance, I think in other ways too, not just on Zoom. So that's a good thing. But, you know, a lot of times we've been talking about planning this webinar conversation. A lot of the focus when you talk about online learning is a lot about tools and platforms and cool hacks and tricks. And so the question that I wanted to ask to sort of expand on that conversation and invite your perspective is, what are the most important considerations in creating an inclusive, equitable, and collaborating learning space when designing course activities and assignments online? And then how can you think about selecting and incorporating digital tools to facilitate that kind of inclusive learning environment in a community engaged context?
Oh, so this should be easy, right? We've got like 5 hours to talk.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Yeah. Surprise.
Right.
No.
So I mean, this is it's a loaded question, and I think this is going to be so much of this is we already know in the pivot to COVID how exclusive going online was as a practice in so many ways. In part because institutions weren't prepared for it, and they weren't prepared for it because they made active decisions over the last decade to keep kicking to the can the idea that emergencies will happen, and you won't be able to go in a face-to-face class. So I think like there's something to be said there of there's a dynamic of, I don't know that we've learned the lessons of the spring as we go into the fall, and so there's a very deliberateness with which I would say when we think about how to make the classroom in this digital space equitable, we might have to take a few steps back because we're still not there. And we're not there I'm not sure when we'll be there. So within that, you know, the thing that I'm thinking a lot around service learning or around community creating community is really paring it back. And in some ways really for this fall semester, for many of the reasons that other people have been speaking, like simplifying. And if that results in something that starts to look a little bit more like, and I should clarify, like I'm speaking from a context where a lot of the digital service learning I've been doing has been at different have been at places like community colleges. They are not necessarily places that are research oriented. And that does make a difference in the kinds of projects that people take on often, and as a adjunct and not necessarily as a full-time scholar, that impacts, you know, the projects that I and so many other faculty that make up these places. So all of that is to say, like, there is something to consider about kind of pulling back and going and dipping toes in slowly and thinking about the more simplified volunteer projects out there to start to get familiarity, because we are trying to mix just the traditional classroom in a time of pandemic with service learning, which has its own layering of of pedagogical practices, and digital learning, which has its own layering of pedagogical practices. And again, while a pandemic, while an economic disaster, and a very tense-filled election is going on. So I'm usually not one for like being conservative in most ways, but this is one area where I do feel like we have to be delicate here, because there's so many chances for us to fail our students, fail our communities, fail ourselves as educators.
Thank you, Lance. I think that's our really important consideration, certainly to keep in mind as we move forward with this conversation and into the rest of the summer and fall. Our last, I want to invite for the first kind of round, our last panelist, but certainly not least panelist, Danielle Leek, with a question about, and thinking about also in addition to combining traditional classroom being disrupted, looking at service learning, civic engagement, community engaged learning pedagogy, and digital learning, how now to navigate institutional structures for support and where to seek support when thinking about developing these kinds of experiences. So Danielle, the question I have for you is, when building a community engaged course or experience online, what are helpful strategies to include various stakeholders on and beyond campus in the design process? And how then too could you cultivate a network of support and communication once the course has begun?
Well, Jane, I can't help it. I'm going to be the rebel in my answer to your question, but the conversation goes where it goes sometimes. And since we led ourselves down the path of talking about issues of digital equity in online classes, I think it's important to talk first about like our most important stakeholder, right, which is our students. And I think they are the path forward in this, right? When we think about what the equity considerations are in an online class, those equity considerations start first and foremost from the fact that students often have, and all of us are subject to the cultural narratives that shape the way that we think about technology and what we can do with technology. And our implicit biases for how we believe students come to their technology experiences are all influencing the way that we're having this conversation right now. So the most important resource I think everybody could go and get, which we never put into the documents for this, but listening to this conversation we should have, is the Peralta online equity framework for online classes. You should get it, you should look at it. It is a description of what each and every one of us can do, even if it's just a little bit, to make sure that if we are going to start to work towards any kind of e-service learning experience at all, that we are taking steps to make efforts to involve our students in the process, and to do so in a way that tries to advance equitable practices and engagement for our students. And one of the most important kind of underlying assumptions is the idea that our students have cultural wealth that they bring to their experiences, that we need to empower that. And our campus partners do as well. So answering more directly the question, a lot of the folks that I think we don't often see as our primary partners in traditional service learning experiences need to be. So this is a time to really build connections to our campus IT departments, and to start to know the folks who run our learning management systems, our instructional designers. This is how Lance and I got connected. This is why we do this work together. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity, and to understand how much of partners a lot of the folks on our campus can be in helping us to see breadth in our communities. And so our campus communities, which is kind of where John started, the path that got me into this way of thinking. So I'll just suggest that those are kind of ideas that might help to guide us to some other conversations. So thanks to all of you for having us be a part of this conversation, letting us be a part of your community today.
Yes. And thanks for that rebellious answer, Danielle. I
Sorry
appreciate
about
it.
that.
I think it really, I think it brought a lot of important streams of conversation together. So I appreciate that. And it leads really well too into the question that I want to pose to all of our panelists, building on Danielle's response too, to talk about this question of equity, inclusion, and how to respond not only to distance learning, online education being at the forefront, but also the uprisings related to racial justice and renewed, and in some cases, new commitments to anti-racist practice, both in community engaged teaching and learning and in higher education more broadly. So this next question I have for folks to think about is, as we know, COVID-19 has laid many systemic racial and socioeconomic inequalities bare, including a renewed awareness of the digital divide and gaps in access, as well as the stark inequities in online learners having the necessary space, time, resources, and attention to engage fully in online learning environments, not to even mention the questions around community partners and community organizations. So for you all to consider, what are the implications of these issues for those teaching and facilitating community engaged learning experiences online in particular? And what are some strategies that course designers and facilitators can use to make these disparities visible and work to create online inclusive learning environments as well? That's a big one, but in however folks want to kind of enter into that conversation, what are your thoughts on those particular questions and issues? Lance, you have your hand up, so I will call on you. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I think first I will just say from an instructional designer point of view, as somebody who also teaches online and is thinking about this space, I think the one thing people, if you're thinking about trying to create a sense of community or empower any kind of democratic experience in the classroom, you have to really think about how you use your learning management system. Inevitably, you have, there are ways in which there are things you have to do in there, especially if we're going to be remote, such as keep grades and the like. But be very careful, because it's very easy, and I say this from personal experience as somebody who's done these things, it's very easy to slip into the, well, I can do these things, so I will do these things, and create very power imbalances of knowledge. I'll give you one of the worst example, not one of the, an example for me that I look back and I'm like, wow, that's me leveraging technology in the most unfair way. I often make my readings available through the learning management system, and I would use that as a means of getting students to admit whether they did the readings or not. Well, I can see whether you've even accessed that reading or not. So really be thinking about the digital space and the ways it either intentionally or doesn't intentionally reinforce a hierarchy. In one way, kind of as we're talking about solutions, I've done a lot of moving out of that, is so much of doing or trying to use the LMS to the degree that I have to, but exporting a lot of the materials, the things that we do, into things like Google Docs. And a great example is my syllabus, where the goal of the syllabus is it is a contributive document. So as part of the first week, they go in, and because it's a Google Doc, they can add stuff, they can use comments and ask questions, in setting that as a precedent that we do throughout the class with most of the learning materials, where they are encouraged to treat it as a negotiation or a space of dialogue, the guidelines themselves, the readings are places where we do. So really thinking about that very deliberately and not being lost in the way that the learning management is structured to make you the all-powerful odds. It's so easy to slip into.
Right.
Thank you. Jean, go ahead. I see your hand up as well.
Thank you. I want to add to what Lance said. That we were very intentional when we were crafting this webinar to make sure that we had practitioners and we had instructional designers on here, because I think a lot of times people aren't even thinking about the instructional design, and that needs to be one of the biggest considerations. I know that we have to think about the fact that we have to understand that we're looking at critical awareness with students, and we need to try to help them look at their identities and their awareness, you know, of their privilege. And how do we then kind of disrupt that replication of oppression in educational practices? So we want to think about that as we're kind of designing our things. I think I saw Patty Clayton on this call. If she's on, you know, maybe she can wave. She and Bob Bringle just put out an article. It's a 2020 article about quality standards and specific instructional design, which I think would be a really great piece for people to look at. Patty, if you can hear me, please put that up in the resources, or I can add it later. I guess another thing I would say too is that as I started my own personal investigation of this in terms of how I was thinking about how I was going to teach, I came across a really interesting resource. It's an article by Pratt and Daniluk in 2017, and it's about reconciliatory pedagogy. And it's talking about how you analyze and break apart the complex realities that surround our students and colleagues of color. And I thought, wow, it helped me a lot to start thinking about how I wanted to frame some of the different things that I would do. Now, I used to be a professor. I was a professor for 15 years at Hamlin, but I also now, I run the nonprofit. And so I think about my interactions with my other community partners. And when I'm looking at how I'm designing projects, I'm using this pedagogy. I think the other thing too, and I'm moving out of the screen for 2 seconds to reach for this resource. I have it right here, and it's about social emotional learning. And where did I put it? There are a couple of different things here. There's a report that was done by Castle, and it just was put out in July of 2020. I'll hold it up for you right here. You can see it. And it's talking about kind of a roadmap for how you work with social and emotional learning. And people are thinking, oh, maybe you only have to do that K-12. No, our college students are going to need it a lot. And I'm speaking now also as a parent who's about to send my baby to be a freshman in Ohio. So there are a lot of social emotional things that are going with everyone. And I think that's a wonderful resource. And then I also found another resource that I have here that's also this year, and it's from the Social Emotional Learning Center, and it's strategies for, I can't do that with my background, strategies for trauma-informed distance learning. And I think these are also some really good resources, because we're, as my colleague was talking about earlier here, just about the fact that students are our primary constituents. That's right, and they're going to have issues. But I also believe that any of the community partners and any of the service learning that we're going to be working with, there is going to be a big need for social emotional the whole way around. I think you all heard me earlier when I said I'm in St. Paul in Minneapolis, and I can drive down Lake Street and there's nothing there. It looks like a bomb went off with all of the riots because of what has happened with the killing of George Floyd. It's been horrible. And like one of the wonderful organizations down there, a wonderful nonprofit known as McGizzy, is a Native American nonprofit that helps with so many things with housing and education, and it was burned completely to the ground. And so some of the service we're doing now is like trying to get realtors to donate their time to help them find another temporary space close by so they can continue to do the work they're doing. And I probably longer than I should have, so I'll be quiet.
No, thank you for sharing all those resources. And again, just to let you know, we'll capture these during the breakout room conversations, which we're going to move into at this moment, just to put a pause on this, this very rich conversation, but allow you all now to have an opportunity to talk with one another. I see there's already some responses coming in through the Google form, so thank you for that. And so what I will do now is we're going to pause the panelist conversation, take some time for you to sort of debrief, reflect, extend, and then we'll come back together in about 15 or 20 minutes to have another round of larger group conversation. Okay, well, welcome back from your breakout room conversations. I have been checking in the on the Google form. Looks like there were some great conversations, great resources captured. And also, I just want to remind folks too, the session resources document does have, for example, I saw something come up on the chat, information about joining the Digital Service Learning Listserv is included in that resources document. And the resources that will be shared today also will be added to that document as well, and several resources have been added since we've first started too. So that's one of the beauties, as Lance was talking about, of Google Documents, is you can add in real time. So after that moment, or that time for conversation, I wanted to re-engage the panel, and also if things have come up for you since you've come back and you want to throw a question into the chat that doesn't get that you did not put into the Google form, please feel free to do that as well. But one of the things I wanted to point to is this is a question actually that came in before the breakout room, so I think is an interesting question I'd love for the panelists to reflect on. So someone offered this observation that one of the key takeaways is that really service learning is not that different in online contexts than it is in a face-to-face context. And so for folks who would have that observation or say, well, really, there's nothing I need to think about that differently when approaching this. Kathy, I see your thumb going up, and I would love to have your thoughts on that particular question. Oh, you're muted, Kathy.
You guys don't really want to hear what I have to say anyway, right?
I do.
No, I don't want to take too much of anybody's time, but really, I can assure you that students, faculty, and community partner learning sites can have a win-win by engaging everyone together in indirect forms of service learning, advocacy-based types of service learning, and research-based types of service learning. When COVID hit, we had 151 credit service learning students, not to mention about 8,000 other students that we had to move to some other form other than direct service learning because it wasn't happening anywhere. And we had community partners that stepped up to the plate and said, hey, we've got this project going on a school to prison pipeline research grant. We need 16 to 20 of your service learning students that can work with us. And we'll Zoom with them and we'll walk them through and we'll engage them, and they can connect what it is that they're doing with their courses. We'll take them in public health, sociology, education, all of the areas that fit what that particular grant was. And our students came out of there. The feedback that we got from everybody involved was, wow, what a great experience. I almost gained more from this than I did with some of the direct face-to-face, hands-on kinds of things that I do. So it's how you think about it, how you frame it, how you engage everybody, how you get buy-in from everybody that I think helps to make it successful.
Thank you, Kathy. I wanted to also, a theme in many of the questions that came up in the on the Google form, also a lot of questions about what does service learning, what are models for community engaged teaching and learning or service learning that are high quality, but that move beyond direct service, or even sometimes don't have a community partnership attached. What are your thoughts about those kinds of models of it's more indirect service or thinking beyond the typical model a lot of folks are using in designing service learning courses in a face-to-face environment?
go?
Go,
No?
Lance, yeah.
Okay. So, and this is something me and Danielle have talked a lot about, is in going online, this might be one of the more interesting differences that I think for us has been really fun to explore. So I slipped into service learning kind of like through the back door. Like I was doing, and I'm sure many other have the experience, you were doing it and then you found out, oh, that's what that's called. In particular, I was doing it because I had students in my American literature course creating audio narrations of the works that they were reading and submitting them for evaluation and ultimately to be hosted on LibriVox.org, which is a website of public domain books that have been turned into audiobooks by volunteers. And so for me, one of the things that I think about, or I when I think about digital service learning, is there's this really interesting long tail of the things that the students do that people 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line can benefit from. So I have students who have created audio narrations of American literature that are on this site that other people are going to benefit from. And I see it in other ways, such as like if you're creating a learning experience or a set of digital video or a set of videos for tutorial videos around math or what have you for a community, your local second grade after school program, what have you, putting them online, now you get to this whole other population of people who can and will benefit from that. So for me, there's this really interesting thinking of like, there's potentially people that it's being created for directly, and then also the secondary audiences that will benefit from it. Even for my students creating the audio narrations, it benefits future students who now have audio narrations of short stories to also listen to. So they're being taught, they're hearing the voices, literally the voices of past students, but then that's also living on the site for others. And I think similarly of things like Wikipedia projects where you have students creating those things, that there's a very different, time, there becomes an asynchronous community. Which I think is another interesting way of what happens with digital service learning.
Great. Thank you, Lance. Do other panelists have anything to add on that idea of sort of broadening traditional models?
Yes, actually, I had shared in our group some information about an alternative service learning guide that I created in spring for the summer, and that's something that we're going to actually use now as part of our general offering. But some of the things that came up were discipline oriented or based, as well as general offerings, particularly with transcriptions. That's a really wonderful way for students to serve, and they're not online all the time because of what's concerned about not having to be on the screen all the time. So what can they do in their home or in their area without having to be on the screen? But perhaps they could submit it electronically.
Right.
So something like that. But the transcriptioning is really is very important. I think the podcasting, we talked about that. Creating guides of their own about whatever topic would be of interest and certainly would be of relevance to their coursework. So I'm just kind of giving a few things. I'm going through it now, but I'm going to share this. I was asked if I could share it, and so I'm certainly going to share it. And I really just kind of searched a lot of information online myself. And then another thing I found today, actually, as I was preparing for the fall, is that organizations like the Red Cross, they're looking for digital volunteers to, do a lot of their work. And once they receive information from people, the information that they're able to use, they need volunteers to compile that information so that they can help the people in need. So those are just a few.
Wonderful.
Thanks for that. I want to
Yes,
chime in on that. I want you to know, like, Lance has a lot of those different things on his listserv. If you guys join that listserv, I think it'd be really helpful because it talks about all the different things that people are doing. I found that tool to be very valuable. But I also want to say, it also depends on what your purpose is for what it is you want to do. If you're doing, okay, I want to do this to get them civically engaged, that's one thing. Or I want my students to do service, that's another. But if you want to do the true service learning, remember, you have to have that academic link, that service and learning reciprocity, and the reflective piece. One of the things that I have found in reading up on this a little bit more with critical service learning and also in online formats is that you want to consider even having them do a pre-reflection before they do anything else, so they can go back and look at that pre-reflection after they have done the things they've done and have done their final reflection, so they also can see their own growth. Because as you know, so much of what we do in service learning comes from self-report of the students. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jean. That's a great, it's really important to keep in mind as well. And I would say too, if you're looking for ideas, because I know the theme of the webinar was not just service learning or community engaged learning and teaching, but also civic engagement more broadly. I know a resource from my own organization that I work with, Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact, the Social Change Wheel. That's something that's also included in the resources. If you're just looking for kind of a way to broaden your conception of what are different ways that you could think about experiences in and beyond the classroom on campus and with community, what are the range of ways that you can think about engaging? So we found for our member campuses, that's been a very helpful resource. So even if you're deciding if you're going to be doing service learning at all, that might be a good place to look as well.
Jane, are you also telling them that you updated it?
No, well, we did. Yes, I wasn't telling them that for them, but
no,
it's also in the resource. We did. We updated it this summer. Yes, so
it has some really great new pieces in it that you want to take a peek at. If you've used it before and say, "Oh, I've done that," no, you haven't used this one.
Thank you, Jane.
Sorry, just for put that out
very
there.
kind. No, that was very kind. Thank you. I wanted to pose this question out too, because I think as kind of as we move toward our closing, this was a great question that someone had submitted, a participant. How do we balance the uncertainty about partner capacity and student capacity, and probably faculty capacity and staff capacity? But for students particularly, would they want to engage virtually on top of being on the screen for many or all of their classes, and the compressed time frame of the semester starting at many schools in mid-August when thinking about designing these experiences? So do any of the panelists or others have thoughts on that particular question of balancing capacity and potential for, overwhelm and burnout too? John, go ahead.
Yeah, it's always been I've always noticed that the most interesting stuff that happens on campus does not happen in classrooms. The most interesting stuff is happening through student organizations. So I think if you're a faculty member and you want to engage students in the things they really want to engage in, so maybe figure out a way to have students in your course support the work of students demonstrating leadership on your campus. Because I think that there's, this is a great time to tap into the natural desire for students want to lead change. I run a social change leadership website, and the people who contact me, they're always looking for co-conspirators, if you will. So folks who, they can lock arms with because they have similar visions for the future. And I think don't be afraid to have this thing driven by faculty, by syllabi, it's like, take the energy that exists in students in this co-curricular area and see if there's a way that you can support it, even if it's like with courses.
Right, thanks, John.
Can I add something, Jane?
Yes, please.
I think one of the things that we've been doing is also collecting these sort of mutual aid moments, like how students have stepped up to participate and create change. And so maybe some of it is seeing what they created already, right? A lot of students have been stepping up, creating their own organizations or working with different projects. So tapping into how they've already motivated themselves in this moment to create change, I think is a good compliment, and maybe creates a little less work for us to structure for them, but really them taking ownership in this moment.
Thank you.
I'd echo that, what Marisol just said. I think that, first I'd encourage faculty to really be purposeful and intentional about the time that they ask students to spend on on Zoom and on camera. I think that as we move towards a more purposefully planned semester, we will see less of that. A lot of what happened in the quote unquote pivot was sort of our natural reaction of trying to, you know, replicate a face-to-face classroom experience in the best way that we knew how. But I also think that it's important to remember that in the context of higher education, most of our students are adults and they can make good choices, and that the best way that we can make sure that students are able to experience higher education in its fullest form and service learning and civic engagement in its fullest form is to make connections with them and to give them the opportunity to feel welcome to come to us and talk with us and build connections with us as instructors, and to show care and ask them to speak with us if they feel as if they need a change in the learning environment for them, but otherwise allow them to make the choice and to have agency and to not be paternalistic and assume that they don't have the power to make decisions about what is right for them in their learning. I hate to think that there may have been awesome, amazing learning experiences that I didn't get because somebody was worried that I would have been on screen too much. I would have loved to have been on screen for awesome moments like this one with the people in this webinar space. Trust your students. They're awesome. They're brilliant, and they are going to change our world. I know it.
You bet.
Absolutely. And that element of choice too, right? Building in the opportunity for choices, right? Not to restrict just because you're assuming, but offering multiple paths in, I think, is also a really important thing that I'm hearing come through your answer to Danielle. So thank you for that.
Jane, there was also something that came through
Yes.
in our breakout session. And we had a wonderful participant in there saying, you know, it'd be great to have more opportunities and more sessions to talk with other faculty members about what they're doing, and even just have like brainstorming sessions. And so I want to put that out there to Marisol and others at the Compact. Maybe this is another thing we do. I asked if it would be discipline specific or service specific, and they said, you know, really you could do it both ways. But these next 2 to 3 semesters, I think, are going to be really difficult for a lot of people as they're looking to do this. And you have to give yourself the grace and permission to make mistakes this fall. Don't try to bite off more than you can chew. Try something small, you know, bring your community partners in on your online classes or your face-to-face classes and plan together, and, you know, use that triangle of engagement between the community partner, the instructor in the school, and, you know, and the students, and what can you do, and be kind to yourself. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. And Marisol, is there a good way right at this moment, I mean, to kind of capture interest in something like that, even like with a yes in the chat or something like that for?
Sure. I mean, there were some of those conversations happening earlier on when the pivot happened in the spring, and those tapered off a little bit, and they were happening sort of based on particular compacts or by regions. But yeah, if folks are interested in those kinds of things, you can include it in the chat, and we'll work towards building that. We do have a fusion course going on right now that is a course focused on preparing for online teaching and engagement. We will be hosting a few more of those courses in the fall as well, and as you know, as things change. And so we'll continue to build our programming to meet the moment. We also are in the plans of developing some programming that looks at issues of equity and racism and civic community engagement in higher education. So really delving into this piece around racial justice is going to be an important space for us, particularly this coming fall. And we'll continue to bring programming that kind of meets the needs of our members at this moment. I also think that like right now is a time for us to interrogate our field, the ways that we've contributed to paternalism, racism, and white supremacy, and thinking about the ways that we need to pivot. Think about how we imagine direct service and how the problematics of that, and move towards spaces that is really about democratic engagement across the board and full participation. So delving into that hard work is part of what we need to do moving forward. And this time in this situation sort of is creating that opening for us to do that. So I just want to thank the panelists for this great panel. We had a great registration number and participation, and to all the attendees, thank you for your voice. Thank you for sort of figuring out how this is going to work on your campus in this uncertainty, and being part of this broader community. So until next time, thank you all.
Yes, thank you. I've shared in the chat too, there's a discount code for the book. We'll add that to the session resources. So thanks everybody for your engagement. It was a great time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And please don't hesitate to contact us if you need any help.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure, everyone.
Thank you.
You good to end, Marcel?
Let's wait a couple minutes. I just want to touch base with some of the panelists if you all can stay on. Yeah.
Of course.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Bye, Kitty. Trent. Bye, Trent and the kitty.
Okay. Aw. Hi, pretty one. All right.
It's probably good to stop recording, I would assume.
Sure.
I